Imagine building an empire worth $3 billion, only to discover your only daughter, the heir to everything you've worked for, clearing champagne glasses at a stranger's wedding. Not as a guest, as the help. That's exactly what happened to Richard Bennett on a Saturday evening in Newport, Rhode Island. And what he did next changed everything. This is that story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Bennett name carried weight in Manhattan. Richard Bennett had spent 32 years transforming a small construction firm his grandfather left him into Bennett Global Industries, one of the largest real estate development companies on the East Coast. His daughter, Claire, grew up in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. She attended the finest private schools, summered in the Hamptons, and by age 21, had everything money could buy. Everything except what she actually wanted: freedom to be herself. Claire never fit the mold her father had designed for her. While other daughters of Manhattan's elite were launching fashion lines or working at their parents' companies in carefully crafted positions, Claire volunteered at soup kitchens and tutored kids in the Bronx. She'd sneak out of charity galas early to meet with her volunteer coordinator. Richard saw it as a phase, something she'd outgrow once she took her rightful place in the family business. He was wrong. The breaking point came on Claire's 23rd birthday. Richard had arranged everything without asking her. A lavish party at the plaza, 300 guests from New York's most powerful families, and an announcement that Claire would be joining Bennett Global Industries as Vice President of Community Relations. It was the perfect position, he thought. It combined her interest in helping people with the family business. But when Richard stood up to make the announcement, Claire's seat was empty. She'd left 30 minutes earlier, walked out through the kitchen exit, and never came back. For 6 months, Richard searched. He hired private investigators, reached out to every contact Claire had, even offered rewards for information. Nothing. His daughter had vanished completely. The media had a field day. Headlines speculated everything from kidnapping to running off with a secret boyfriend. Richard's business partners started questioning his judgment. If he couldn't manage his own family, how could he manage billion-dollar projects? The pressure was immense, but nothing compared to the fear that consumed him every single day, not knowing if his daughter was safe. What Richard didn't know was that Claire had planned her disappearance carefully. She'd been saving money from a trust fund her grandmother had left her, one Richard didn't control. She'd obtained a new identification under her grandmother's maiden name, Claire Morrison. She dyed her blonde hair dark brown, started wearing glasses she didn't need, and moved to a small apartment in Providence, Rhode Island. Far enough from New York to disappear, close enough to stay on the East Coast. She wanted to know what it felt like to earn her own way, to be valued for her work rather than her last name. Claire's first job was at a local coffee shop. She earned $9 an hour plus tips. It was humbling, standing behind a counter taking orders from people who would have once been beneath her notice. But it was also liberating. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody expected anything from her except a good latte and a smile. She made friends with her coworkers, went out for drinks after shifts, lived in a studio apartment that cost more than half her monthly income. For the first time in her life, Claire understood what most people dealt with every single day. After 8 months at the coffee shop, Claire saw an advertisement for a wedding service company looking for event staff. The pay was better, and she'd always loved weddings, the joy and hope they represented. She applied as Claire Morrison, listing her coffee shop experience and volunteer work. The manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd been in the industry for 20 years, hired her on the spot. Patricia said Claire had something special, a natural grace and attention to detail that couldn't be taught. If only Patricia knew that grace came from years of attending New York's most exclusive events. Claire worked her way up quickly. She started as a setup assistant, arranging chairs and linens. Then she moved to serving staff, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Within a year, she was one of Patricia's most requested servers. Brides specifically asked for Claire because she had an elegance about her, a way of moving through a crowd that made her seem like she belonged anywhere. The irony wasn't lost on Claire. She'd spent her whole life trying to escape elegance, only to have it follow her into her new life. The work was hard. Claire would spend 12 to 14 hours on her feet during wedding weekends, sometimes working 2 events in one day. Her feet ached, her back hurt, and she'd collapse into bed exhausted every night. But she was happy. She was making around $30,000 a year, barely enough to cover her modest lifestyle. But every dollar was hers. She'd earned it. She'd wake up each morning knowing that her value wasn't tied to her father's money or her family name. She was just Claire, a hard-working woman making her own way. Claire made close friends with her co-workers. There was Marcus, a graduate student working events to pay for his master's degree in social work. Jessica, a single mom of 2 who'd been in the industry for 15 years. And Daniel, an aspiring chef who used wedding gigs to study high-end catering. They'd meet for breakfast at a local diner after overnight shifts, sharing stories and supporting each other through the exhausting work. These friendships meant more to Claire than any connection she'd had in her old life. These people knew her, the real her, not the Bennett fortune. Before we go deeper into what happened next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. June 15th started like any other Saturday. Claire arrived at the venue at 10 in the morning to help set up for a wedding at the Breakers, a historic mansion in Newport that had been converted into an event space. It was one of the most prestigious venues in Rhode Island, the kind of place Claire had attended events at in her previous life. She remembered coming here for a fundraiser when she was 19, wearing a Valentino gown that cost more than she now made in 3 months. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The wedding was huge, 400 guests, a symphony orchestra, and a budget that Patricia mentioned was close to $2 million. Claire's job was simple: work the cocktail hour, serve champagne during the reception, and help coordinate the dessert service. She'd done this dozens of times. She knew exactly how to move through a crowd, how to anticipate when someone needed a fresh drink, how to be present but invisible at the same time. That skill, being present but invisible, had become her specialty. What Claire didn't know was that Richard had been invited to this wedding. The groom's father, Thomas Morrison, was a commercial real estate developer Richard had worked with on several projects. Under normal circumstances, Richard would have declined. He rarely attended social events anymore, not since Claire disappeared. The empty seat beside him at these gatherings was a constant reminder of his failure. But Thomas had insisted. He'd mentioned that some major investors would be there, potential partners for a project in Boston. Richard's business advisors convinced him to attend. It would be good for him to get out, they said. It might help him move forward. Richard arrived at the Breakers at 6:30, just as cocktail hour was beginning. He made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and making small talk. He'd perfected the art of appearing engaged while his mind was elsewhere. He was standing near the terrace, pretending to listen to a conversation about interest rates, when a server walked past carrying a tray of champagne. Something about her movement caught his eye. It was familiar, the way she navigated the crowd, the angle of her shoulders. He turned to look, but she'd already disappeared into the crowd. Richard tried to focus on his conversation, but that moment of familiarity had unsettled him. He'd had these moments before, dozens of them in the past 2 years. He'd see someone with blonde hair and his heart would stop, thinking it was Claire. He'd hear laughter that sounded like hers in a restaurant and spend 20 minutes searching for the source. His therapist called it prolonged grief, the mind's way of trying to find what it had lost. But this felt different. This wasn't about blonde hair or laughter. It was about movement, the way someone carried themselves. 20 minutes later, Richard saw her again. She was refilling glasses at a nearby table, her back to him. She wore the standard server uniform, a simple black dress, black shoes, her dark brown hair pulled back in a low ponytail. Nothing remarkable about her appearance. But when she turned slightly to pick up an empty glass, Richard caught her profile. His champagne glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. Every head in the immediate area turned toward the sound. Claire, hearing the crash, turned instinctively to help. Their eyes met across 15 feet of crowded space, and time seemed to stop. Richard saw the recognition flash across her face, followed immediately by fear. Claire saw her father, looking older than she remembered, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Was it anger? Shock? Relief? Before she could process what was happening, Patricia appeared with a dustpan, breaking their eye contact as other servers rushed to clean up the broken glass. Claire's hands were shaking as she walked quickly toward the service kitchen. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone around her could hear it. 2 years. She'd been careful for 2 years, and now it was over. She knew her father had seen her. She knew that look of recognition. There was no point in running. Where would she go? She stood in the service kitchen, her back against the cool stainless steel counter, trying to catch her breath. Marcus found her there 5 minutes later, asked if she was okay. She lied and said she was fine, just felt a bit lightheaded. Richard stood frozen as servers cleaned up around him. His mind was reeling. That was Claire. He was certain. His daughter, his only child, was serving drinks at this wedding. Not as a guest, not as someone's +1. As hired staff. Questions flooded his mind faster than he could process them. How long had she been here? Was she okay? Why was she working as a server? Had he been so terrible a father that she'd chosen this life over the one he'd provided? The man standing next to him was still talking about interest rates, completely unaware that Richard's entire world had just shifted. Richard excused himself and walked toward the service area, but security stopped him. Guests weren't allowed in the back of the house. He tried to explain, then stopped himself. What would he say? That he needed to speak to one of the servers because she was his missing daughter? They'd think he was crazy or drunk. He returned to the reception area, positioned himself where he could watch the servers coming and going, and waited. He'd waited 2 years. He could wait a few more hours. Claire made it through the rest of the evening on autopilot. She served dinner, poured wine, cleared plates, brought out dessert. She could feel her father's eyes on her the entire time. Every time she glanced in his direction, he was watching her. Not approaching, just watching. It was unnerving, and somehow comforting at the same time. She'd spent 2 years wondering if he'd even noticed she was gone. Now she had her answer. The way he was looking at her told her everything. He'd noticed, he'd grieved, and now he'd found her. The reception ended at midnight. Claire helped pack up equipment, load vans, break down the dessert station. She moved slowly, deliberately putting off the inevitable. When she finally changed out of her uniform and walked toward the parking lot, Richard was waiting by her 10-year-old Honda Civic, the car she'd bought used for $3,000. He looked completely out of place in his tailored Tom Ford suit, standing in a staff parking lot at 1 in the morning. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Richard said 5 words that broke through 2 years of silence. Are you okay? Are you safe? Not, where have you been? Not, how could you do this? Just, are you okay? Claire felt tears burning behind her eyes. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Richard took a step closer, stopped himself, clearly unsure what to do. She could see him struggling with whether to hug her, yell at her, or just keep standing there. Finally, he asked if they could talk. Claire suggested a diner she knew that stayed open 24 hours. They took separate cars, giving her time to process what was happening. The diner was nearly empty at 1:30 in the morning. They sat in a booth in the back corner. A tired waitress brought coffee without being asked. Richard wrapped his hands around his cup but didn't drink. He just stared at his daughter, as if he still couldn't believe she was real. Claire looked different, thinner, older, her hands rough from work. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite identify at first. Then he realized what it was. Peace. His daughter looked at peace in a way she never had living in Manhattan. They talked until the sun came up. Claire explained everything. Why she'd left, how she'd done it, what her life had been like for the past 2 years. She told him about her studio apartment, her co-workers who'd become like family, the satisfaction she felt earning her own money. She talked about learning to budget, to cook, to appreciate things she'd always taken for granted. Richard listened without interrupting, which was hard for a man used to dominating every conversation. He wanted to tell her she was being naive, that she was throwing away opportunities people would kill for, but he just listened. When Claire finished, Richard told his side, the fear that had consumed him when she disappeared, the sleepless nights wondering if she was alive, the guilt that maybe he'd pushed her too hard, expected too much. He told her about the private investigators, the false leads, the toll her disappearance had taken on him. He'd lost weight, stopped sleeping properly, threw himself into work to avoid thinking about his failure as a father. His business partners had staged an intervention 6 months ago, insisting he see a therapist. He'd finally agreed, though he'd spent most sessions in silence. Claire hadn't realized the depth of his grief. She'd convinced herself that he'd be relieved she was gone, that she'd been nothing but a disappointment to him. Hearing him describe his pain made her see how self-centered her reasoning had been. She'd been so focused on escaping what she perceived as his expectations that she hadn't considered how her disappearance would affect him. She'd hurt him deeply, and the realization hit her hard. Her choice to find herself had cost her father 2 years of anguish. Was her freedom worth that price? Richard asked what she wanted now. Did she want to come home, continue her life here? He told her he'd support whatever decision she made, though his voice cracked slightly when he said it. Claire explained that she didn't want to go back to her old life, but she didn't want to keep hiding either. She wanted to find a middle ground, something that honored both who she'd been and who she'd become. She suggested meeting regularly, rebuilding their relationship slowly. Richard agreed immediately. He'd take whatever time she'd give him. They met every Sunday after that. Sometimes at the diner, sometimes at Claire's apartment. Occasionally at a restaurant Richard would drive to from New York. They talked about everything: Claire's work, Richard's business, memories from her childhood, his relationship with his own father. Slowly, they began to understand each other in ways they never had. Richard started to see that his daughter's desire for a normal life wasn't a rejection of him, but a search for her own identity. Claire began to understand that her father's pressure had come from love, however misguided the expression. 6 months after their reunion, Claire made a decision. She wanted to go back to school for social work, to formalize the volunteer work she'd always loved. But she couldn't afford tuition on her serving salary. She asked Richard for help, and for the first time in her life, she asked as an adult making a choice, not a child following a parent's plan. Richard agreed, but with a condition. He wanted to fund the entire thing himself, not as a loan, but as a gift. It was his way of supporting who she'd chosen to become. Claire enrolled at Rhode Island School of Social Work, continuing to work part-time at events to maintain her independence. She still lived in her modest apartment, still drove her old Honda, still met her co-workers for breakfast after late shifts. But now, she also had Sunday dinners with her father, occasional visits to New York to see old friends, and a growing understanding of how to balance the two parts of her life. She learned you didn't have to completely abandon where you came from to become who you wanted to be. Richard's perspective on success shifted dramatically. He'd spent his entire life measuring achievement in dollars and properties, only to realize that his daughter found more fulfillment serving champagne than she ever had in a penthouse. It forced him to examine his own priorities. He started a foundation focused on workforce development, helping young people learn trades and find meaningful employment. He hired Claire as a consultant once she completed her degree, valuing her insight into the struggles of working-class families. Their relationship had evolved into a genuine partnership, something it never could have been before. The story spread, as these things do. Business publications wrote about the billionaire's daughter who chose service work over luxury. Some painted Claire as a spoiled rich kid playing at poverty. Others saw her as someone genuinely trying to find meaning beyond wealth. Claire didn't respond to any of it. She'd learned that other people's opinions mattered far less than her own peace of mind. She knew her journey had been messy and imperfect, that she'd hurt people in her quest for independence. But she also knew she'd become someone she could respect, someone defined by her choices rather than her circumstances. Years later, during a speech at a workforce development event Richard's foundation hosted, Claire was asked what advice she'd give to young people searching for purpose. She thought for a moment before answering. She said that sometimes you have to leave everything you know to discover who you really are. But that discovery doesn't mean you have to abandon where you came from. Identity isn't about choosing between your past and your future. It's about integrating both into something authentic. The people in the audience didn't know she was talking from experience, but Richard, sitting in the front row, understood completely. The night at the Breakers became a turning point for both of them. That moment when Richard's champagne glass hit the marble floor, when their eyes met across a crowded reception hall, marked the beginning of something neither had expected. Not a return to their old relationship, but the creation of something entirely new. a father and daughter who'd lost each other and found their way back, changed by the journey. Claire never returned to Manhattan permanently. She built a life in Rhode Island, working as a social worker specializing in helping young adults transition into independence. She still picked up occasional serving shifts during the busy wedding season, partly for the extra money, but mostly because she genuinely enjoyed the work. Her co-workers became godparents to her children. Marcus, the graduate student she'd met serving weddings, eventually became her husband. They had a small ceremony at the same diner where she and Richard had their first conversation after reuniting. Richard walked her down the aisle, tears streaming down his face. Richard scaled back his involvement in Bennett Global Industries, promoted younger executives, and focused primarily on the foundation. He moved part-time to a modest condo in Providence to be closer to Claire and his grandchildren. The man who'd once measured his worth by his company's quarterly earnings learned to measure it by his daughter's happiness and his grandchildren's laughter. He still drove a luxury car and wore expensive suits, but those things no longer defined him. He'd learned, through losing and finding his daughter, what actually mattered. The wedding where Richard discovered Claire became a story they'd tell their grandchildren. How Grandpa shattered his glass, how Grandma tried to disappear into the kitchen, how they ended up talking until sunrise at a 24-hour diner. The kids would laugh at the dramatic retelling, not quite understanding the deeper pain and healing beneath the funny details. That was okay. Some lessons could only be learned through living them. Claire and Richard had both learned theirs the hard way, and they were better people for it. Looking back, both would say that night at the Breakers was one of the most important moments of their lives. Not because it was comfortable or easy, but because it forced them both to confront truths they'd been avoiding. Richard had to face that his vision for his daughter's life had nearly cost him their relationship entirely. Claire had to acknowledge that her search for independence had hurt someone who loved her deeply. Neither was entirely right or entirely wrong. They were just two people trying to navigate the complicated relationship between parent and child, wealth and purpose, expectation and authenticity. So if someone asks what happened to Richard Bennett's daughter, the one who vanished from Manhattan society, the answer is simple. She didn't vanish. She transformed. She went from being Richard Bennett's daughter to being Claire Morrison, server and social worker. And eventually, she became both. A woman who could serve champagne at a wedding with the same grace she brought to helping families navigate poverty. A woman who understood both penthouse views and studio apartment struggles. A woman who proved that identity isn't about choosing between worlds, but about creating your own. In a world that often defines people by their wealth or social status, Claire's story reminds us that true identity can't be inherited or bought. It has to be earned, through choices and consequences. Through mistakes and growth. She gave up billions to find herself, then discovered that finding herself meant accepting all parts of who she was, including where she came from. And Richard learned that letting go of control was the only way to connect with the person he loved most, truly. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give isn't money or opportunity or a carefully planned future. Sometimes it's just the freedom to choose. And the grace to accept those choices, even when they're painful to watch. Richard gave Claire that gift eventually. And in return, Claire gave him something no amount of money could buy, a genuine relationship with the woman his daughter had become. What would you have done if you were Claire? Could you walk away from everything you knew to find out who you really were? And if you were Richard, could you accept your child's choice to reject the life you'd built for them? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers, but they're worth thinking about, because at some point, we all have to decide who we are beyond what others expect us to be. Claire just dared to make that decision at 23, and Richard had the wisdom to eventually support it. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Are you living according to someone else's expectations, or are you creating your own path? It's never too late to start making choices that align with who you truly are. And if you're a parent, ask yourself, are you giving your children room to discover themselves, even if that discovery leads them somewhere you didn't expect? We'd love to hear your thoughts on Claire's journey. Comment below and tell us, would you have had the courage to do what she did? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that challenge the way we think about success, family, and identity. Next time, We'll share the story of a man who walked away from a fortune hours before his wedding, and the secret that surfaced a decade later. You won't want to miss it.